35,000 feet above the Pacific, a flight bound for Singapore, 157 passengers, expecting nothing more than another routine journey. But tonight, this flight will never reach its destination. 3 men have boarded with a different plan. Men with no interest in ransom, no demands for negotiations, only one objective: total destruction. For the passengers, there is no warning, no time to react, no escape at 35,000 feet. The pilots, powerless. The crew, outgunned. And in the aisles, panic begins to spread like wildfire. But hidden among them is one man, a man who wasn't supposed to be here either. A man who has spent his life fighting in the shadows. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble has found him. And now, the fate of everyone on board rests in his hands. Because this is not just a hijacking, this is something far worse. The sun was just beginning to set over San Francisco as Pacific Airlines Flight 157 prepared for takeoff. Its massive fuselage gleaming under the golden hues of the evening sky, engines humming with a steady, reassuring rhythm as passengers settled into their seats, oblivious to the nightmare that would soon unfold at 35,000 feet. Among them sat Darius Cole, a quiet, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, dressed in a dark gray hoodie and jeans, his sharp eyes scanning the cabin with the natural vigilance of a man who had once walked the fine line between law and chaos. A former air marshal turned private security consultant, now just another traveler trying to make his way home after a grueling assignment in Los Angeles. But years of training had drilled instincts into him that never faded. And something about the 3 men seated separately in different sections of the plane sent an uncomfortable prickle down his spine. Their rigid postures, their clipped interactions, their eyes constantly shifting toward one another as if waiting for an unspoken signal. Darius had seen men like them before, and the memory of past encounters buried deep within him began to stir. Yet for now, there was nothing he could do except fasten his seatbelt and watch as the plane taxied down the runway, the familiar force of acceleration pressing him against his seat as the Boeing 777 roared to life, lifting effortlessly into the darkening sky, the city lights fading below as it climbed higher and higher, carrying its 157 souls toward their intended destination, Singapore, a journey spanning nearly 17 hours across the vast Pacific Ocean. But for some on board, it was not a journey meant to end at Changi Airport, and as the aircraft reached cruising altitude, the faintest ripple of tension seemed to crackle in the air, unnoticed by most, yet undeniable to those who had learned to recognize the signs. And for Darius Cole, that familiar feeling, the one that had saved his life more times than he cared to count, was screaming at him now, whispering in the back of his mind that something was terribly wrong. Darius Cole exhaled slowly, forcing himself to relax as the aircraft settled into its cruising altitude, the steady hum of the engines filling the cabin while flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, distributing drinks and meals to the passengers, most of whom had already settled into the rhythm of a long-haul flight, some watching movies, others reading, a few already dozing off under the dim cabin lights. But Darius couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine, his instincts sharpening, as he discreetly observed the 3 men who had triggered his suspicion, each positioned in a different section of the plane yet seemingly aware of each other's presence, their gazes flicking subtly across the cabin, their hands resting too stiffly on the armrests, their bodies too still, too focused, as if waiting for something. Darius had seen terrorists before, had studied them, hunted them, fought them, and survived them. And while nothing about these men was overtly hostile yet, their posture, their subtle exchanges of glances, the way their eyes lingered on the cockpit door for a fraction too long, it was enough to tell him that they weren't just nervous flyers. But even knowing this, there was nothing he could do yet, nothing except wait and watch, because a wrong move, an accusation made too soon, could mean disaster. And so, as the flight attendants passed by, offering him a meal tray, Darius nodded absently. his fingers tapping lightly against the plastic surface, his mind racing through every possible scenario, calculating responses, identifying potential allies among the passengers, scanning for anything that could be used as a weapon if it came to that. But before he could think further, a flicker of movement caught his eye. One of the men, the one seated near the middle of the cabin, subtly adjusting his watch while shifting his weight forward as if preparing to stand. And that was when Darius knew with absolute certainty that it was about to begin, that whatever these men had planned, they were moments away from setting it into motion. And as the first man finally rose from his seat, his hand slipping into his jacket, Darius's muscles coiled instinctively, adrenaline flooding his veins, because the storm he had sensed was no longer unseen. It was here. The moment the first man stood, Darius Cole's body went rigid, his instincts screaming at him to act. But he held back, knowing that if he moved too soon, he would lose any advantage he had. His eyes locked onto the man as he stepped into the aisle, a tall figure with a neatly trimmed beard, his right hand disappearing into his jacket just as the second man in the rear of the plane stood as well, their movements perfectly synchronized, rehearsed, precise, while the third hijacker, seated closest to the cockpit, remained still for now, his role yet to be played. And then, in a swift motion, the first man pulled a weapon, a compact pistol with a suppressor screwed onto the end, a choice that sent a clear message. They didn't want chaos, not yet. They wanted control, and as gasps rippled through the passengers nearest to him, the terrorist lifted the gun and fired a single, silenced shot into the ceiling, the sound a muffled pop, yet deafening in its finality, silencing the murmurs of confusion as sheer terror took hold of the cabin. The second hijacker mirrored the first, producing his own weapon and waving it toward the terrified passengers, shouting in a deep, steady voice that all heads should remain down, all hands visible, his words chillingly calm. And Darius barely shifted in his seat, his mind whirring as he took stock of their weapons, their formation, their strategy, knowing that a hijacking like this meant one of two things. They were either planning to use the plane as a bargaining chip, or they intended for no one to survive. And as the third man finally stood and approached the cockpit door, producing a stolen keycard from his pocket, Darius knew the latter was more likely, his pulse a steady drumbeat in his ears as he scanned the cabin, calculating distances, assessing threats, pinpointing weaknesses in their formation. But before he could make his move, the first hijacker's gaze swept over the passengers and landed on him, pausing for a fraction of a second too long, a flicker of recognition in his dark eyes. And in that moment, Darius realized the worst possible truth. They knew who he was. Darius held the hijacker's gaze for a fraction of a second, careful not to betray the sudden shift in his heartbeat, the way his muscles coiled in anticipation of what was to come. But the damage was already done. The man had recognized him, or at the very least, suspected him. And in an operation like this, suspicion was enough to put a target on his back. The terrorist's gun lingered in his direction, his lips pressing into a thin line as if weighing a decision. But then, just as quickly, he turned away, snapping his attention back to the cabin as he barked another order, reinforcing the fear already spreading like wildfire among the passengers. No one moves. No one speaks. We are in control now. Do exactly as we say, and you may live. The lie was evident, but no one dared question it, their bodies shrinking into their seats, their eyes darting to the cockpit, where the third hijacker was now pounding on the door, demanding entry, waving the stolen keycard in front of the lock, while the pilots hesitated on the other side, their voices muffled but urgent, a desperate attempt to stall for time. Yet Darius knew they wouldn't hold out for long. The moment that door opened, the fate of Flight 157 would be sealed. And if these men were willing to execute a well-planned takeover at 35,000 feet, they had no intention of letting anyone walk away from this alive. He forced himself to think, to plan, to calculate his next move before the window of opportunity slammed shut, scanning the nearby passengers for possible allies, but most were too frozen with terror to be of use, their hands gripping armrests, their breaths shallow, their minds struggling to comprehend the reality of their situation. And then, Almost imperceptibly, a woman across the aisle met his eyes, mid-30s, dark hair tied back, her hand resting on the arm of a teenage boy beside her, her gaze filled with something most others lacked in that moment: awareness. Darius didn't know who she was, but he knew that look, she was assessing the situation, just like he was, searching for an opening, and that meant he wasn't alone. But before he could send even the smallest signal, the hijacker closest to him turned sharply and pointed his gun directly at Darius's chest, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You, stand up, now." Darius felt the weight of every eye in the cabin pressing against him as he slowly unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements deliberate, controlled, his heart pounding like a war drum beneath his ribs as he rose to his feet, facing the hijacker head-on. He knew what this was: a test, an attempt to establish dominance, to see if he would break under pressure, because the man holding the gun had already sensed something different about him, something that didn't fit the profile of a helpless, panicked passenger, and that alone made him dangerous in their eyes. He kept his expression neutral, his breathing steady, forcing his muscles to remain loose even as his mind raced through the possible outcomes. If they wanted to kill him, they would have done it already, which meant they needed something from him first: information, cooperation, submission. But that wasn't going to happen, not without a fight. The hijacker, a wiry man with a cold, calculating stare, took a step closer, his pistol now only inches from Darius's chest, and in the silence of the moment, the flight continued its smooth course over the endless ocean, the horrifying normalcy of it making the situation feel all the more surreal. "Who are you?" the terrorist asked, his voice quiet but laced with suspicion, his finger hovering near the trigger. And Darius, knowing that hesitation would be fatal, responded without missing a beat, his tone even, unshaken. "A man trying to get home just like everyone else," he said, watching the flicker of uncertainty flash across the hijacker's face, as if debating whether to believe him. But Darius knew the truth. They didn't recognize him by name, only by presence, by the way he carried himself, and that meant he still had an advantage, still had time to manipulate the situation. But that window was shrinking fast. The hijacker studied him for another second, then exhaled sharply, shoving the gun against Darius's ribs, a silent warning before stepping back, motioning for him to sit. And Darius did, not out of fear, but because he knew that now was not the time to strike. Not yet. Because if he was going to stop these men, he needed to do it right. And for that, he needed to know exactly what they wanted. As Darius sank back into his seat, his body tense, but outwardly composed, the hijacker lingered a moment longer, his dark eyes searching for cracks, for any sign of defiance. But when none came, he turned sharply on his heel and strode toward the cockpit, where the third terrorist had finally forced his way inside, the reinforced door now ajar, revealing a glimpse of the stunned pilots pressed against their controls, hands raised, powerless to stop what was unfolding. Darius watched as the terrorist with the gun conferred in hushed tones with the one inside, exchanging nods before stepping back into the cabin, his voice suddenly louder, more authoritative, as he addressed the passengers for the first time. "This plane is under our control," he announced, his accent faint but unplaceable, his tone chilling in its composure. "We have one demand. It will be met, or everyone on this aircraft dies." The words sent an audible shudder through the cabin, a ripple of gasps and muffled cries, mothers clutching their children tighter, the elderly passengers squeezing their armrests with white-knuckled grips. But Darius kept his focus trained on the man speaking, on the way he deliberately paused after saying, "One demand," letting it sink in, making sure he had everyone's attention. This wasn't just about making a threat, this was about control, about ensuring every single person aboard knew that their survival depended entirely on these men. Then, as if sensing the mounting fear had peaked at the perfect moment, the hijacker continued, his voice clipped, efficient. "We are transmitting our demand to your government now. They have 4 hours to respond. If they refuse, we will begin executing passengers one by one." A fresh wave of horror rolled through the cabin. But Darius wasn't focused on the terror anymore. He was focused on the timeline. Because 4 hours was a very specific window. Too long for a simple ransom demand, but too short for a major negotiation, which meant that whatever these men wanted, it wasn't money. It was something that couldn't be bought, something urgent, something that had to be handled immediately. He shifted slightly, his gaze flicking to the cockpit, where the third hijacker now stood behind the captain's chair, watching the radio, waiting for a response from the outside world. And in that moment, Darius realized the real danger wasn't the men with guns, it was the fact that no one knew what they wanted. And if that demand wasn't met in time, Flight 157 would never reach Singapore or anywhere at all. The cabin remained eerily silent, every passenger frozen in a collective state of shock as the hijackers' ultimatum hung in the air. But Darius wasn't focused on the fear spreading through the plane. He was focused on the implications of the 4-hour window, trying to decipher the real reason behind the hijacking. Something wasn't adding up. If these men had intended a suicide mission, they would have stormed the cockpit immediately and taken the plane down. But instead, they were waiting, making demands, which meant they needed something, or someone, on this aircraft alive. His mind worked fast, cycling through the possibilities. But before he could piece anything together, the hijacker nearest to him, the one who had tested him moments ago, suddenly moved, striding down the aisle toward a trembling flight attendant. A young woman with tear-streaked cheeks, her hands gripping the back of his seat for support. Without hesitation, he grabbed her by the wrist and yanked her into the aisle, causing her to yelp in terror, passengers gasping as the barrel of his pistol pressed against her temple. "We will not wait for proof of your government's cooperation," the hijacker announced coldly, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. "You will all understand that we are not bluffing." And with that, before anyone could react, he pulled the trigger. The silenced gunshot was muffled, barely more than a whisper, but its impact was devastating. Blood spattered across the seats as the flight attendant crumpled to the floor, lifeless, a heavy stillness swallowing the cabin as the horror of what had just happened set in. A woman in the front row let out a strangled sob. A man further back cursed under his breath, and across the aisle, the teenage boy Darius had spotted earlier, buried his face in his mother's shoulder, his entire body shaking. Darius clenched his fists, his heart hammering as the terrorist wiped a streak of blood off his sleeve and turned back to the cockpit, speaking into a radio connected to their ground contact. "One dead. 3 hours and 50 minutes remain." That was when it hit Darius. This wasn't about negotiating. This was about leverage. They were trying to force someone's hand, and if they were willing to kill hostages so soon, it meant the person they wanted to break was already on this plane as thoughts raced through the passenger manifest, trying to pinpoint who was valuable enough to warrant this kind of operation. But before he could act, a panicked voice suddenly cut through the silence. "Stop! Stop! I know why you're here!" The outburst came from seat 22A, a middle-aged man, sweating profusely, his face pale as he struggled to stand, his breathing ragged. The terrorists snapped to attention, their weapons swiveling toward him as if they had been expecting this, and that was when Darius knew this man was the key. Whoever he was, whatever he had done, the terrorists were here for him. The lead hijacker stalked toward him, gripping the back of the seat in front of him, leaning in dangerously close. "Then say it. Now." The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the cabin as if hoping someone, anyone, could save him, but there was no escape. His voice trembled as he finally spoke. "It's about the exchange, isn't it?" Darius's stomach dropped. "Exchange? What exchange?" The hijacker smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "Good. Then you know what happens next." And before anyone could react, he lifted his gun. But instead of shooting the man, he turned and fired at the cockpit controls. The bullet struck the avionics panel, sparks flying as the plane lurched violently to the left. Passengers screaming as oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, turbulence shaking the aircraft, as if the very sky itself had turned against them, and that was when Darius realized The hijackers weren't just using this flight as leverage. They were forcing it off course. The moment the bullet shattered the cockpit controls, Flight 157 lurched violently, the Boeing 777 tilting hard to the left as chaos erupted inside the cabin. Passengers screamed, oxygen masks dangled uselessly from above, and overhead compartments burst open, sending loose luggage crashing down into the aisles. Darius gripped the armrest, steadying himself as the aircraft shuddered, but his mind was racing faster than the falling plane. This wasn't just a hijacking anymore. The terrorists were actively taking control of the aircraft's trajectory, steering it toward an unknown destination, and if the avionics panel was damaged badly enough, the pilots wouldn't be able to override them even if they wanted to. Through the open cockpit door, he caught a glimpse of the third hijacker, now forcing the captain out of his seat, shoving him toward the back of the cabin while one of the co-pilots lay slumped over, unconscious or worse, his head resting against the shattered control panel, red streaks trailing down the dashboard. The lead hijacker, the one who had recognized Darius earlier, turned back to the terrified passengers, his expression calm despite the chaos around him. "No one moves," he said, his voice eerily smooth as if this was all part of the plan. As if the screaming and the plunging altitude were nothing more than a means to an end. But Darius wasn't buying it. There was more to this. He still didn't know why these men wanted this particular flight. But now, with the plane being diverted, one thing was clear. They weren't waiting for demands to be met. They were taking matters into their own hands. Darius's gaze flicked toward seat 22A, where the sweating man who had spoken up moments ago now sat paralyzed with fear, gripping the seat in front of him like a lifeline. Whatever exchange he had mentioned, it had clearly been enough to confirm the hijackers' mission, which meant there was no longer any reason for them to stall. The executions would begin soon, and unless Darius did something now, more people were going to die. But before he could act, the mother and teenage boy he had noticed earlier shifted slightly across the aisle. The woman caught his eye just for a second, her expression tense but focused, and then, almost imperceptibly, she reached into her jacket pocket and flashed something silver. A thin blade, barely visible beneath the fold of fabric. Darius's stomach clenched. She had a weapon, and more importantly, she was ready to use it. This changed everything. But before Darius could make a move, a new horrifying realization hit him. The plane, which had been tilting into descent, suddenly leveled out, and with a cold, sinking certainty. He understood exactly what had just happened. The terrorists had taken full control of the aircraft. This wasn't free fall anymore. This was a redirected flight to an unknown target, and whatever their mission was, it was only just beginning. The sudden leveling of the aircraft sent a fresh wave of dread rolling through Darius. This wasn't an uncontrolled descent, wasn't a desperate act of destruction. This was calculated, which meant the terrorists had just taken over the plane's navigation system, redirecting Flight 157 to somewhere only they knew. The cockpit door was still open just enough for him to glimpse the third hijacker, now seated in the pilot's chair, his hands moving over the remaining controls with practiced efficiency, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. Darius had assumed they were just armed extremists, but now it was clear. One of them was a trained pilot. That changed everything. Across the aisle, the woman who had subtly flashed a blade shifted in her seat, her body tense but controlled, the teenage boy beside her gripping his armrests, his knuckles white as his mother whispered something in his ear. Darius didn't know who she was, but she was no ordinary passenger, not with that level of awareness, that confidence in the face of death. She had the poise of someone who had been in dangerous situations before, and that meant she was either an asset or a threat. His instincts told him she could be an ally, but there wasn't time to find out the needed information, and he needed it now. His eyes flicked towards seat 22A, where the sweating man sat trembling, his entire body hunched forward as if he were trying to disappear. But the lead hijacker wasn't letting him off the hook, strode back down the aisle toward him, his gun hanging loosely in his hand, though Darius knew it was anything but relaxed. "You spoke too soon," the terrorist muttered, his voice low, dangerous, like a predator closing in on its prey. "You should have waited for your turn." The man in 22A swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the cockpit. Then to Darius, a plea for help, though Darius was in no position to act yet. Then the man finally whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. "Please, you don't have to do this. I already know the exchange won't happen. They won't give him up." The hijacker's face remained impassive, but his grip on the gun tightened ever so slightly. "That is not for you to decide." Darius's mind spun. Give who up? What kind of exchange would warrant a full-scale hijacking like this? It wasn't money, wasn't ransom. It was a person someone so important that these men were willing to hijack a plane and redirect it to force the trade themselves. And then it hit him. A prisoner. These men weren't just terrorists, they were operatives. Mercenaries sent to force the release of someone being held by the US or one of its allies. This wasn't about money or ideology. This was about extracting someone from captivity, someone dangerous enough that the only way to get him back was to force an international incident. Darius's gut twisted. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to start a war. But before he could act, the hijacker in front of 22A moved fast. Without a word, he raised his gun and slammed the butt of it into the man's temple, sending him crumpling to the floor with a muffled groan. The cabin erupted in panicked gasps, some passengers shrinking back, others stifling cries. But the terrorist merely adjusted his grip on his weapon, stepping over the unconscious man like he was nothing more than an obstacle. 3 hours remain, the hijacker announced coldly, scanning the terrified faces around him. "We will begin eliminating passengers every 3 minutes until our demand is met." Darius's pulse pounded. This wasn't just a hijacking anymore. It was a countdown to slaughter. And unless he acted soon, they were all going to die. As the terrorist stepped over the unconscious man in seat 22A, the entire cabin felt like a pressure cooker, ready to explode. The passengers were paralyzed, too terrified to move. The hijackers were methodical, unshaken, and the countdown to execution had begun. 30 minutes until the next innocent person was killed. Darius forced his breathing to steady, forcing his body to relax when every instinct screamed to attack, to break the man's neck right then and there. But it wouldn't work. Not yet. The lead hijacker was watching him closely, eyes flicking back toward Darius as if he was expecting something, maybe even waiting for him to make a move. And then something unexpected happened. The plane lurched violently, a sudden, unnatural drop that sent passengers yelping in shock, trays rattling, luggage shifting overhead. Turbulence. But this wasn't normal turbulence. Darius had flown enough in his life to feel the difference. The hijacker in the cockpit must have miscalculated something, maybe an altitude shift or an adjustment in their redirected flight path. For the first time, one of the terrorists actually looked uncertain. The man gripping the cockpit doorway turned and called something in Arabic, his voice sharper than before, urgency creeping in. Darius didn't hesitate. He took the moment. As the plane continued to shudder, he lunged, fast and hard, grabbing a metal thermos from the side of his seat and swinging it in a vicious arc toward the nearest hijacker's hand. The impact crunched against bone, the gun clattering onto the floor just inches from his feet. The terrorist shouted in rage, twisting toward him, but Darius was already moving, launching from his seat like a coiled spring. He drove his elbow into the man's throat, cutting off his air, shoving him backward into the seats as passengers around them gasped in disbelief. Then came the gunshot. A muffled pop from the other side of the cabin. Darius instinctively ducked, twisting his head to see that the lead hijacker had fired a round, not at him, but at a passenger who had tried to run. The body of a young man, early 20s, wearing a hoodie and headphones. Slumped onto the aisle floor, a clean bullet hole through his chest. Blood already spreading in a dark pool. The message was clear. Resistance meant death. Darius froze, his jaw clenching as he saw the raw horror in the eyes of the passengers around him, especially in the teenage boy, who had buried his face into his mother's shoulder, his entire body shaking. The lead hijacker stepped forward, gun pointed at Darius's head now, his expression colder than before. "That was your only warning, hero." Darius held his gaze, his body screaming to fight, but he knew he had just crossed a thin line. The hijackers had the advantage. They still held control of the cockpit, and now, the next death would be his own if he made another move too soon. But then another twist came crashing in. From the cockpit, a voice, urgent, demanding, came over the intercom. "Mayday, mayday. This is Pacific Airlines Flight 157. Emergency hijack code transmitted. Does anyone copy? Over." The hijackers snapped toward the cockpit. One of the pilots, bleeding but still alive, had managed to activate the radio distress signal. Someone on the ground knew what was happening. For the first time since this nightmare started, Darius saw something in the terrorists' eyes that he hadn't seen before. Panic. The moment the distress call rang out over the intercom, everything changed. Panic. That was the first crack in the hijackers' confidence that Darius had seen, and he knew exactly what it meant they weren't supposed to be exposed yet. The plan was crumbling around them, and the pressure was mounting fast. One of the terrorists, the one standing closest to the cockpit, let out a furious snarl and spun toward the radio, slamming his gun against the pilot's head, knocking him unconscious again. "Shut it down!" the lead hijacker barked, stepping forward. His weapon still trained on Darius, but his focus split now between maintaining control of the passengers and the new, unexpected variable the world now knew about the hijacking. That meant fighter jets, emergency landings, military intervention. Time was running out. And that's when the second break happened. The mother across the aisle, the one Darius had already clocked as a fighter made her move. In one swift motion, she lunged, pulling a second blade from the lining of her jacket, and slashed upward. The hijacker nearest to her barely had time to react before the knife sliced clean through his throat. A wet gurgling noise filled the air as the terrorist staggered back, clutching his neck, blood spurting between his fingers, his eyes wide in shock. He collapsed backward, hitting the floor with a sickening thud. For the first time, one of the hijackers was dead. The entire cabin exploded into chaos. Screams, movement, passengers breaking their frozen terror and reacting, some trying to get up, others shielding themselves from whatever would come next. The lead hijacker's face twisted in rage, his gun immediately swinging toward the woman. Darius had to act. He exploded from his seat, closing the distance in a single second, grabbing the hijacker's arm before he could pull the trigger. He wrenched it to the side, redirecting the shot, and the suppressed bullet buried itself harmlessly into the overhead compartment. The terrorist snarled, twisting violently, but Darius was faster. He slammed his elbow into the man's ribs, knocking him off balance, then drove his knee straight into his solar plexus, sending him stumbling backward. "Now!" the woman shouted, tossing her bloodied knife toward Darius, snatched it midair, spinning just as the hijacker recovered, lunging toward him. Darius dropped low at the last second, dodging the attack, and then drove the knife deep into the terrorist's leg. The man screamed, staggering, but didn't go down. Darius knew he had only seconds before the other hijacker, the one still in the cockpit, joined the fight. He needed to end this now. With one final burst of speed, he twisted the knife in deeper, forcing the hijacker to collapse onto his knees. Darius yanked the blade free and with brutal precision slammed the butt of the handle into the side of the man's head, knocking him out cold. The hijacker hit the floor. 2 down, 2 left. But before Darius could even catch his breath, a new sound filled the cabin. A robotic beeping noise, slow at first, then faster. Darius's eyes snapped toward the dead hijacker's body. Something was blinking on his wrist. A detonator. "Oh shit, bomb!" someone screamed. And that was when Darius knew. The terrorists had just activated their backup plan. The beeping grew faster, a rhythmic pulse of death that sent fresh waves of panic rippling through the cabin. Passengers screamed, some scrambling over seats, others frozen in horror as the flashing red light on the dead hijacker's wrist blinked with increasing intensity. A detonator. That meant one thing. A bomb was already on board. Darius's instincts took over. He lunged toward the hijacker's body, grabbing the lifeless wrist, trying to decipher the device strapped tightly around it. It wasn't just a simple trigger. It had a timer display. 5 minutes. 5 minutes until whatever explosive was rigged to the plane detonated. "We need to find the bomb," Darius barked, snapping his head toward the woman who had killed the first hijacker. She was already moving, dragging her son behind her as she searched under seats, compartments, anywhere a bomb could be hidden. The remaining terrorists realized what had happened almost as quickly as Darius did. The lead hijacker, the one who had recognized Darius from the beginning, roared in rage, reaching for his radio, shouting something in Arabic to the cockpit. But the transmission was cut off when one of the passengers, a man in his 60s with the strength of someone half his age, tackled him from behind, slamming the terrorist against the bulkhead. For the first time since the hijacking began, the terrorists were losing control. But that didn't matter if the plane blew up in midair. Darius ripped the detonator from the dead hijacker's wrist, studying it fast. It wasn't a remote trigger. It was a failsafe. These men had planned for the possibility of failure. If they lost control of the mission, they would make sure no one survived. "Where would they put it?" the woman shouted, still searching under seats. "Cargo hold, flight deck, somewhere near the fuselage supports," Darius yelled back, scanning the cabin for any sign of where it could be. A commercial airliner like this had limited spaces to conceal an explosive large enough to bring it down, and the hijackers would have needed access before takeoff. Baggage hold was the most likely place. But they didn't have time to get down there. The cockpit door slammed open, and the final hijacker emerged, the one who had been flying the plane. But he wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a dead man's switch. The entire cabin froze. "No one moves, or we all die now." His voice was calm, cold, completely unfazed by the chaos around him, because he still held the ultimate power. One press of his thumb, and whatever bomb was hidden on this aircraft would detonate immediately. Darius locked eyes with him, his mind racing. The timer on the detonator he held read 3:42 分. 3 minutes and 42 seconds. Not enough time. He had to do something right now. But before Darius could make a move, the woman acted first. In one fluid motion, she threw her knife. It spun through the air. Fast. Precise. Burying itself deep into the terrorist's shoulder. The hijacker screamed, his grip loosening, but not letting go. Darius exploded into motion. He crossed the distance in an instant, slamming into the terrorist, grabbing for the switch as the man roared in pain. The two of them crashed against the cockpit doorway, struggling for control. Darius's fingers wrapping around the man's wrist, wrenching his thumb away from the trigger. Passengers screamed. The plane tilted hard, turbulence rattling the cabin. Darius used every ounce of strength he had. One final twist, one brutal punch to the terrorist's throat, and then a sickening snap. The hijacker collapsed. The dead man's switch rolled onto the floor. Silence. Then Darius looked down at the timer on the detonator. 2:14 remaining. And then he realized the bomb was still active, and they were still running out of time. The cabin was deathly silent, every passenger frozen in horror as the digital countdown on the detonator ticked down past 2 minutes. A guaranteed death sentence, unless Darius found the bomb and disarmed it immediately. The hijackers were dead or incapacitated, but their plan was still in motion. Somewhere on this plane, an explosive was primed to go off, and if it did, Flight 157 would vanish into the ocean in a ball of fire. Darius spun toward the cockpit, scanning the instrument panels, but the pilots were still unconscious, and the controls were damaged from the earlier gunfire. If he didn't act now, none of them would live long enough to attempt an emergency landing. "We need to find the bomb, now!" Darius barked, his voice slicing through the panic. The woman, the one who had killed the first terrorist, was already moving, her hands frantically searching the overhead compartments, the seats, anywhere small enough to conceal a device. "Not here! It's gotta be below!" she shouted. Darius's gut twisted, Cargo hold. It made the most sense. They would have planted it somewhere near the baggage compartment where it couldn't be easily found. But there was a problem. The access hatch was near the rear of the plane, and they had less than 2 minutes. Then, suddenly, something unexpected happened. A voice, weak, pained, but alive. It's in the maintenance panel." Darius whipped around. The man in seat 22A, the one the hijackers had knocked unconscious earlier, was stirring, blood dripping down his temple, his face pale. Darius rushed toward him, kneeling by his side. "Where? What maintenance panel?" The man swallowed, forcing the words out. "Back, near the galley, starboard side." His eyes locked onto Darius's with something dangerously close to guilt. "I'm sorry. I thought they wouldn't go through with it." Darius's breath caught in his throat. He knew. This man wasn't just some random hostage. He had been part of this. Before Darius could react, the woman was already running toward the galley, her son clinging to her arm, his eyes wide with terror. 1:30 remaining. Darius had no time to process the betrayal. He sprinted after her, shoving past overturned carts and scattered debris, his pulse pounding. Then he saw it, a small, unmarked panel on the starboard side, barely noticeable against the interior wall. It was slightly ajar. "Here!" The woman dropped to her knees, prying it open, and there it was. A military-grade explosive strapped inside, rigged to detonate in less than a minute and a half. But before Darius could move, the final twist came. A gunshot. A sharp pain exploded in Darius's side. He staggered, gripping his ribs, his vision blurring as he turned and saw seat 22A standing in the aisle, holding a gun. "You weren't supposed to get this far," the man rasped, his face twisted in desperation. He was working with them. Darius's mind barely had time to register the betrayal before the woman launched herself at the traitor, a blur of motion, tackling him to the ground just as he fired another shot. The bullet missed, shattering a panel near the window. Darius clutched his wound, forcing himself to stay upright. 58 seconds left. He had no choice. He dropped to his knees, yanked the explosive from its casing, and saw the primary detonation wire. One cut, one chance. If he was wrong, they all died instantly. The woman slammed her knee into the traitor's throat, knocking the gun from his grasp. "Do it!" she screamed. 30 seconds. Darius inhaled deeply and sliced the wire. Silence. The countdown stopped at 0:07. And then, the entire cabin erupted in breathless, stunned disbelief. The bomb had been disarmed. But Darius wasn't done. He turned toward seat 22, bleeding, broken, but still conscious. And he needed answers. Now, the cabin was silent. A fragile, stunned silence that filled the space where moments ago there had been a countdown to death. The passengers barely able to comprehend what had just happened, but Darius wasn't finished. His breath was ragged, his side burning from the bullet wound, but his focus was locked on the man from seat 22A, the one who had betrayed them all. The traitor was coughing, sprawled out on the floor, his face twisted in pain as the woman, Darius's unexpected ally, kept him pinned with a knee pressed into his chest. Her son stood behind her, his young face still frozen with fear. But his mother? She was steady, focused, just like Darius. "Who are you working for?" Darius growled, his voice sharp despite the pain radiating through his body. He staggered forward, clutching his ribs, but his knife was still in his hand, still dripping with blood from the terrorist he'd taken down minutes ago. A warning. Seat 22A, whoever he really was, laughed weakly, his breath hitching from the pressure on his chest. "Doesn't matter anymore," he rasped, his lips curling into a bloody smirk. "They'll never let this plane land." Darius froze. The woman's eyes flicked toward him. "What does he mean?" The hairs on the back of Darius's neck stood up. Something was wrong. And then, as if to confirm it, the cockpit radio crackled to life. "Pacific Airlines Flight 157. This is the United States Air Force. You are currently off course and have failed to respond to our emergency directives. You are now being escorted by two F-22 Raptors. You have exactly 90 seconds to comply and identify your situation, or we will be forced to engage. The blood drained from Darius's face. The Air Force thought they were still a hijacked plane, and they were preparing to shoot them down. The traitor grinned, his breath shallow but triumphant. "I told you," he whispered. "You didn't stop anything." Panic erupted inside the cabin as Darius grabbed the cockpit radio, forcing his voice to stay even despite the chaos behind him. "United States Air Force, this is Darius Cole, former U.S. Air Marshal. The hijackers are dead or neutralized. The bomb has been disarmed. We are not a threat." I repeat, Flight 157 is not a threat. Do not engage. Silence. Darius's pulse pounded as he watched the radar display on the cockpit screen. Two fighter jets were closing in fast, their transponders blinking red, their target lock engaged. The pilots were still unconscious, the plane still off course, and the Air Force had less than a minute before they fired. Then the radio crackled again. "Pacific Airlines 157, your transponder has not been reactivated, and your aircraft remains unresponsive. This is your final warning. Turn back to your designated flight path or prepare to be engaged." Darius's heart slammed against his ribs. They didn't believe him. The woman behind him shouted, "What do we do?" And then, the traitor in seat 22, let out a weak chuckle. Darius spun back toward him. "What the hell is so funny?" The man smirked, his face still bleeding. "I told you," he whispered again. "This flight was never meant to land." And then Darius saw it, something glinting in the man's hand. A second detonator. And his thumb was already pressing down. Time slowed. Darius's body reacted before his mind even fully processed what was happening. He launched himself forward, grabbing the traitor's wrist just as he pressed the detonator. A muffled click. A single horrifying second where Darius thought the plane was about to explode midair. But nothing happened. The traitor's smirk faltered. Darius snarled, "You really thought I wouldn't check for a backup trigger?" Because before disarming the first bomb, Darius had already suspected the possibility of a second failsafe, and he had quietly disabled the secondary charge before the fight broke out. The man's eyes widened in realization, and then Darius slammed his fist into his skull, knocking him out cold. The cabin was still in chaos, but there was one last problem. The Air Force still had their target lock, and less than 30 seconds left before firing. Darius whirled back to the cockpit, grabbing the controls, his hands shaking. The plane was still descending, still flying off course, and the fighter jets were about to fire. He had to do something. Now, Darius's hands gripped the cockpit controls, his pulse thundering in his ears as the radio crackled one last time. "Pacific Airlines Flight 157, you have failed to comply. Engaging target." Missiles away. Darius's stomach dropped. Somewhere in the sky behind them, two heat-seeking missiles had just been fired. The passengers in the cabin were still panicking, unaware of the death streaking toward them at supersonic speed, but Darius had no time to warn them. His only focus now was survival. He grabbed the control yoke, ignoring the pain from his bullet wound, forcing his breath to steady as he snapped his eyes to the altimeter. The plane was still too low, still locked on the wrong trajectory, but the autopilot was off. The hijackers had completely disabled it to keep them on a crash course. Which meant one thing. Darius had to fly this plane manually, with only seconds left before impact. "Hold on!" he shouted to no one in particular, then yanked the yoke hard to the left. The plane screamed in protest, the entire fuselage shuddering as it tipped into a sharp banking turn. Passengers screamed. Overhead compartments burst open, but Darius had no choice. The missiles were heat seekers. They were locked onto the plane's exhaust signature, which meant the only way to survive was to kill the engines. "Brace!" Darius bellowed, and with a quick prayer, he slammed the throttle back to 0. The roar of the engines died instantly. The Boeing tilted violently, a gut-wrenching freefall as it lost all propulsion, dropping like a stone through the sky. Behind them, the missiles streaked forward searching for the heat signature, but there was none. At the last second, the twin rockets veered off course, missing the plane by mere feet, their contrails flashing past the windows before disappearing into the sky. Darius didn't even have time to celebrate, because now they were in free fall. Alarms blared inside the cockpit. The Boeing plummeted, gravity yanking it toward the ocean below, the passengers screaming in pure terror. Darius shoved the throttle forward again, but there was no time for a full restart. The engines coughed, sputtering as they struggled to reignite. He needed another plan. Fast. His eyes snapped to the navigation display. Land was approaching. Not Singapore, but Guam. A small landing strip was visible on the horizon. It wasn't meant for a plane this big, but it was the only chance they had. Darius's hands tightened on the controls. Come on, baby. Don't give up on me now. The engines coughed, then roared back to life. The plane jerked forward, regaining just enough power to level out. The passengers screamed again, this time in disbelief rather than terror. Darius didn't wait. He lined up with the landing strip, ignoring the fact that the runway was too short, that he had no landing gear controls, that they were coming in way too fast. This was it. One shot, one impossible landing. The ground rushed toward them. Darius pulled the nose up, dumping as much speed as he could. The wheels hit the runway hard. Sparks erupted as the landing gear collapsed, the plane skidding down the asphalt in a shower of fire and smoke. The fuselage groaned, but it held together. And then, silence. They had stopped. They were alive. Darius slumped back in his seat, his body shaking, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The passengers in the cabin were silent then. Cheers, sobs, disbelief. They had survived. And as the emergency crews rushed toward the wreckage, Darius let out a long, shaky breath. The nightmare was finally over, or so he thought, because as he turned his head, he locked eyes with the woman who had saved him in the fight. And for the first time, she looked uneasy. Then she leaned in close and whispered the words that made his blood run cold. They weren't just after a prisoner. Darius's pulse spiked. She glanced at her son back at him. They were after him. Darius's exhaustion vanished in an instant. The adrenaline was still burning through his veins, his breath ragged, but the woman's words cut through the chaos like a scalpel. They weren't just after a prisoner, they were after him. His gaze snapped to the boy. The teenager, maybe 14 or 15, had been terrified throughout the hijacking, but now that Darius was really looking at him, something felt off. Not in the way he reacted, but in the way his mother was shielding him. She wasn't just a protective parent, she was hiding him. Darius's voice was low, measured. You need to explain. Now. The woman swallowed hard. She cast a quick glance toward the wreckage, toward the emergency crews that were rushing toward the plane, sirens blaring in the background. They had seconds before the world descended on them. My name is Rebecca Sinclair. Her voice was steady but barely above a whisper. I work for the CIA, Covert Intelligence Division. Darius felt his stomach drop. He'd been in law enforcement, military operations, private security. He knew the name. CID wasn't just any division of the CIA. It was off-the-books black ops. The kind of people who didn't exist. He stared at her, his mind racing. You're telling me this now? She exhaled sharply. Because now it matters. Because now. She gripped her son's arm tighter. You understand why they hijacked this plane. Darius's jaw clenched. Who is he? Rebecca's eyes darkened. Then she leaned in closer. His real name is Alexei Rostov. Darius froze. Number. That couldn't be right. The Rostov name was infamous in intelligence circles. Alexei Rostov wasn't just some kid. He was the son of Anton Rostov, one of the most dangerous defectors in modern history. Anton Rostov had been a high-ranking Russian FSB agent who defected to the US nearly a decade ago, trading top-level intelligence on Moscow's operations in exchange for asylum. And now his son, a kid Darius had assumed was just another frightened passenger, had been sitting on Flight 157 the entire time. Everything suddenly clicked into place. The terrorists weren't just mercenaries. They were state-funded operatives. And the exchange the hijackers had mentioned earlier? They weren't trying to trade a prisoner for freedom. They were trying to force the return of Anton Rostov by capturing his son. The hijacking, the bomb, the Air Force intervention, it had all been about one thing. A message to the US government: give up Rostov or his son dies. Darius's blood ran cold. The realization hit him just as the first federal agents began approaching the wreckage. Rebecca's grip tightened on her son. "We need to disappear," she whispered. "Right now." Darius looked at the agents, the flashing lights, the news cameras already rolling from the airport perimeter. She was right. This wasn't over. This was just beginning. Darius knew the look of an extraction team when he saw one. The agents approaching weren't standard FBI response units or local emergency personnel. These were the real deal. Dark suits, earpieces, military posture, moving efficiently for a post-crash recovery operation. This wasn't just about Flight 157 anymore. They were here for the boy. Rebecca grabbed Darius's arm, her grip tight. "If they take us, we vanish," she whispered. "They'll package us up, put us in a facility, and we'll never see daylight again." Darius's mind spun. The CIA wasn't just here to debrief them. If Alexei Rostov had been targeted so publicly, then it meant his cover had been blown. The US government wouldn't take any chances now. They had two choices: go with the extraction team, where they would be locked away in a classified location until further notice. "Run!" Rebecca's eyes burned into him. "We need you, Darius. If you don't help us now, Alexei will disappear forever. I will disappear, and I don't know if we'll survive whatever comes next." Darius exhaled slowly. He had been a US Marshal, a man who believed in the system, but he also knew the government could bury things too deep to ever be found again. He had just saved this plane, but the moment the wrong people realized what had really been on board, they might still all die in the dark. His decision took less than a second. "Stay close. Follow my lead." Rebecca nodded once, gripping her son's hand. The agents were 20 feet away now, closing fast. Darius acted. He pivoted hard, yanking Rebecca and Alexei behind him as he moved toward the other side of the wreckage. The emergency crews were too focused on stabilizing the injured, giving them just enough cover. "Where are we going?" Alexei gasped, his voice tight with fear. Darius's gaze locked onto a fuel truck parked near the wreckage, an emergency vehicle that had been moved into position to prevent an explosion on the runway. But it wasn't guarded. "There," Darius pointed. "We steal that truck, and we get off this tarmac before they lock the place down." Rebecca hesitated. "What about?" Darius cut her off. "There's no time. Move." The first agent spotted them. "Hey, stop right there!" Darius didn't. He sprinted toward the truck, Rebecca, and Alexei right behind him. Gunfire erupted behind them. The government wasn't taking chances. They weren't being arrested. They were being silenced. Darius reached the truck first, wrenching the door open. The keys were still inside. He shoved Alexei and Rebecca into the cab just as another gunshot rang out, missing them by inches. Darius slammed the gas. The fuel truck roared to life, tires screeching against the asphalt as they sped toward the airport's perimeter fence. The agents pursued on foot, radios crackling. "They're making a break for it. Lock down the airfield." Darius gritted his teeth, his hands tight on the wheel as the fence loomed ahead. Barbed wire, steel reinforcement, no way through. Then, a service gate. Darius gunned the engine. Rebecca braced for impact. Alexei screamed. The truck smashed through the gate in an explosion of metal and sparks. And suddenly, they were off the airfield, escaping the most powerful intelligence agency in the world. Darius's breath was ragged, but he had only one thought. They weren't safe yet. Not even close. The fuel truck tore through the shattered gate, metal screeching as pieces of chain-link fencing scraped against the sides. But Darius didn't slow down, not for a second. The airport perimeter alarms were blaring, and in the rearview mirror, he saw black SUVs already peeling away from the tarmac, their headlights cutting through the darkness. They were coming. "Hold on," he barked, gripping the wheel as he veered the truck onto the main airport access road, sending up a spray of dust and debris. Rebecca clutched Alexei, her eyes darting between the road ahead and their pursuers. The boy's breathing was ragged, but he wasn't crying. He was processing everything at an alarming speed. "How long until they cut us off?" Rebecca asked, her voice taut with urgency. "Minutes," Darius muttered, scanning the highway ahead. The black SUVs were closing fast. The government wasn't hesitating anymore. Darius's mind raced for options. They were in a fuel truck. Slow, heavy, a rolling bomb if the wrong bullet hit the wrong spot. Their only advantage was that they were already ahead. Think. Then, a highway sign flashed by, barely visible in the dark. Route 1, Tuman Bay exit. 2 miles. That was it. Guam's coastal roads. If they could hit the older back roads, they might have a chance to disappear. "We ditch the truck in 2 miles, Darius said. "Then we go dark." Rebecca nodded, but Alexei turned toward Darius, his voice tight with something other than fear. "Why are they doing this?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. Darius met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "Because you're not just a kid," he said. "You're a bargaining chip in a war." Alexei's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. He understood more than he was letting on. The road narrowed ahead, the glow of the highway exit sign approaching. The first SUV moved in, trying to flank them. Darius gritted his teeth. "Brace." He wrenched the wheel hard left. The fuel truck clipped the SUV, sending it skidding violently across the road, tires screeching as it slammed into a barrier. The explosion of metal and glass filled the night, but Darius didn't stop to check. One down. More coming. The exit loomed ahead. Darius slammed the brakes, sending the massive truck into a hard slide toward the coastal road. Dust and gravel kicking up as they roared onto the isolated stretch of pavement overlooking the ocean. "Now, out!" Rebecca and Alexei didn't hesitate. They threw the doors open and jumped from the cab, hitting the ground running. Darius was right behind them. The fuel truck slammed into a barrier, coming to a shuddering halt, but they weren't sticking around. Darius grabbed Alexei's arm. "Keep moving!" Behind them, the remaining SUVs tore onto the road. Searchlights flashed through the darkness. They had seconds before the agents realized the truck was empty. And then the real hunt would begin. Darius's breath came hard and fast as they sprinted toward the tree line. The jungle beyond the road was dense, treacherous, but it was their only chance. They had escaped the plane. They had escaped the airport. But now, they were running from something much bigger than a hijacking. And the real war was only beginning. Darius didn't look back. He didn't have to. He could hear the SUVs skidding to a stop, doors slamming open, the sound of boots hitting asphalt. The government's elite response team was already on their heels. But that didn't matter, because Darius had spent a lifetime in hostile environments, and he knew one simple truth. If you're being hunted, you take the fight somewhere your enemies don't control. And right now, that place was the jungle. "Move!" he growled, grabbing Alexei's wrist and yanking him toward the dense tree line. Rebecca was right beside them, moving like she had done this before. And she had, Darius could tell, the way she moved, fluid, controlled, fearless. It wasn't just instinct, it was training. They crashed through the undergrowth, the humid night air clinging to their skin as the jungle swallowed them whole. The moment they crossed the threshold from road to wilderness, the world became a different battlefield. Thick vines snagged at their clothes, tree roots jutted from the damp earth, but they kept moving. No hesitation, no slowing down. Behind them, the agents poured in after them. Darius heard the radio chatter crackle through the night. "They're in the jungle. Contain the perimeter. Don't let them reach the cliffs." Darius's mind flashed a map of the island. The cliffs. They were trying to box them in, push them toward the edge, where there would be nowhere to run, which meant they had to get there first. The night was alive with movement. The agents weren't just pursuing them, they were herding them, forcing them into a specific direction, moving like wolves in a coordinated hunt. Darius caught a glimpse of flashlights cutting through the jungle, their beams bouncing wildly off the trees. Then, gunfire. The agents weren't shooting at them. They were warning shots. But that wouldn't last. Darius's breath was steady, his instincts kicking into overdrive. They needed to disappear, and they needed to do it now. There, Rebecca pointed ahead, a steep ravine, a natural drop-off that led deeper into the jungle. Darius grinned. That's our way out. Alexei's eyes widened. We're jumping? Darius didn't answer. He just ran harder. The three of them reached the edge at full speed, leaving them with one choice. They jumped. The fall. The world tilted sideways as they plunged into the darkness, the sounds of gunfire and shouting agents vanishing behind them. Darius hit the slope first, rolling with the impact, his body absorbing the force before he hit the dense foliage below. Rebecca landed beside him, tucking her body perfectly to avoid injury. Alexei hit hard, but Darius was already moving, grabbing the kid and pulling him back to his feet. You good? Darius asked. Alexei nodded, breathless. That was insane. Welcome to the real world, kid, Darius muttered. Above them, the agents reached the cliffside. Darius saw flashlights scanning the jungle below, but it was too late. They were already gone. Darius crouched low, motioning for Rebecca and Alexei to follow him deeper into the jungle. They moved quickly but carefully, navigating the dense terrain, using the darkness as their cover. Finally, after what felt like miles of silence, Rebecca whispered, "What now?" Darius exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow. Now, we disappear for real. Rebecca's gaze was sharp. You have a plan, Darius nodded. I know a guy on this island, ex-military. If we can get to him before they lock the place down, he can get us off Guam. But we need to move fast. Rebecca hesitated. And if we don't? Darius's jaw tightened. Then we don't leave this jungle alive. Rebecca nodded once. Then let's go. And with that, they vanished into the darkness. The hunt wasn't over. It was just beginning. The jungle was alive, but Darius, Rebecca, and Alexei moved like ghosts. Silent, fast, barely leaving a trail. The agents hunting them were well trained. But this wasn't their battlefield. It was Darius's. And he knew how to disappear. They kept moving, navigating through the thick foliage, until finally Darius found what he was looking for. A dirt trail, barely noticeable under the moonlight. Darius turned to Rebecca. This leads to an old airstrip. It's off the books. Used to be military. Now it's just a forgotten relic. If my guy still operates out of there, we have a way out. Rebecca nodded. How much time? Less than an hour, Darius said, glancing toward the distant glow of searchlights creeping through the trees. They won't stop until we're dead. Alexei, still catching his breath, finally spoke. Why don't they just grab me? If they want me so bad, why kill us? Darius exhaled. Because we're loose ends. You're a bargaining chip, but we know too much. If they let us go, the whole world finds out this was never a terrorist hijacking. He looked at Rebecca. They'd rather erase us than explain why an American agency greenlit an international kidnapping. Rebecca's expression darkened, but she didn't argue. She knew he was right. They were liabilities now, and liabilities don't get second chances. The trail led them to the abandoned airstrip, a stretch of runway hidden beneath jungle overgrowth, with a single aircraft parked in the clearing, a modified cargo plane, and standing next to it was the man Darius had come for. A grizzled pilot, ex-military, leaning against the fuselage like he'd been expecting them. His name was Mac Taylor, and he had the kind of face that had seen too much war and survived anyway. Damn, Cole, Mac muttered, eyeing their ragged, bloody state. You always show up looking like death warmed over. Darius cracked a tired grin. I don't come for the conversation, Mac. You got enough fuel to get us off this rock? Mac looked past Darius to Rebecca, to Alexei. He wasn't an idiot. He knew this wasn't just a casual favor. "You're putting me in the middle of something nasty, aren't you?" Max sighed, rubbing his temples. "Biggest favor I'll ever ask," Darius admitted. Max studied him for a long moment, then glanced toward the jungle, where the glow of approaching vehicles was getting closer. Finally, he sighed, "All aboard." They rushed onto the plane, Darius securing the hatch, while Mac powered up the engines. The first SUVs breached the tree line, their headlights cutting through the dark. Darius saw the agents stepping out, rifles raised. A voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Pacific Airlines 157 fugitives. You are ordered to stand down. Surrender now." Darius muttered a curse, grabbing a headset in the cockpit. "Mac, you got anything special under the hood?" Mac grinned. "Remember that time we smuggled intel out of Caracas?" Darius's grin matched his. "Do it." Mac flipped a switch on the console. A thunderous roar erupted from the modified engines, kicking up a hurricane of dust and debris. The agents below were forced to scatter, shielding their faces as the plane rumbled forward. The first gunshots rang out, bullets pinging off the fuselage, but they were too late. The plane lifted off the ground. They were gone. 30 minutes later, the cargo plane flew over the Pacific, its destination unknown, unlogged, untraceable. In the cockpit, Darius sat beside Mac, exhaling for what felt like the first time in hours. Rebecca and Alexei were in the back, both silent, exhausted. Darius turned to Mac. "Where can we land where no one asks questions?" Mac smirked. "I know a place." Darius nodded. That was good enough. For now, they had won. But Darius knew the truth. This wasn't over. Somewhere out there, the people behind the hijacking were still watching. They had failed this time, but they wouldn't stop. Not until they had Alexei Rostov. Not until every loose end was buried. And that meant one thing. Darius, Rebecca, and Alexei, they weren't fugitives. They were ghosts now. And ghosts don't stop running.